what's so fascinating to me, and I hope to make this fascinating to you, is Jesus said so much about fear. But what Jesus said about fear seems so naive if you listen to what Jesus said about fear in isolation. And one of the problems with how the Bible has been presented to many of us, and this isn't anybody's fault, this is just the way of the world, is that we drop into isolated events from the life of Jesus, and we sort of look at them, we kind of bookend them like once upon a time, the end. But in fact, Jesus' entire ministry, especially with his 12 apostles, part of the journey was to teach them how not to be afraid, because the bottom line for Jesus' teaching when it came to fear, like, Jesus, just give us the bottom line when it comes to fear, here it is. All right? Fear not. Stop it. Just quit being afraid. Thank you, Jesus. That's so helpful. I hadn't even thought about that. I'll just stop it. In other words, to use our terminology, he would say, don't let fear or stop allowing fear to be the boss of you, right? I mean, this is his message. Stop being afraid. Which, of course, is easy to say, but virtually impossible to do. And this is what's so interesting, his first century followers, especially the 12 apostles, they felt the same way, because Jesus would say, fear not, don't be afraid, fear not, don't be afraid. And they were, during their time with Jesus, they believed him, but what does that mean? How do you do that? And doesn't that seem a little bit naive, right? So on one occasion, Jesus has just identified his 12 apostles. There's all these, again, if you've been with us, everywhere Jesus went, there was a crowd. There was a crowd, and then there was a smaller group in the crowd called disciples. John calls this group the disciples. And this is the smaller crowd that went everywhere Jesus went. And then within the disciples, there were the apostles, the men that Jesus chose specifically to be his closest group. So Jesus has just finished choosing the apostles. I mean, how amazing is that? You got to be one of Jesus' inner circle. And so he gets them together, and he says, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen. Okay, here's the big picture. Here's the whole narrative. Here's what's going to happen. Okay, I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. Now, to us, that's just a figure of speech. In that day and age, they had seen that. This does not end well. When you send the sheep out among the wolves, that is a bloody, gory mess. So Jesus said, here's the good news. Now that you've signed on, let me tell you what the contract reads. I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves, and you're going to be arrested, and you're going to be beaten. And then he says, don't be afraid. And they're looking at each other like, okay, did we miss part of the message? I mean, is there anything between that? It's like, you're going to send us out, and eventually they were sent out, and eventually they were all arrested, and eventually they were all beaten, and many of them were executed. But just saying at the end of that, therefore don't be afraid, not only did it not take away their fear, that doesn't even make any sense. So Jesus, and this is the part we miss, Jesus took them on a field trip. Now, you are very familiar with this field trip, but when you read about the field trip, you didn't think it was a field trip. You just read it as an isolated incident in the life of Jesus and his disciples. But Jesus, everything Jesus did was so purposeful. It was all going somewhere. It was all connected. And this was the field trip Jesus set up to teach them a lesson about fear. And as soon as I start this story, many of you will rush to the end because you grew up hearing this story. Then, the text says, Matthew tells us that Jesus got into a boat and his disciples followed him because they're his followers. He gets in the boat, they do what Jesus did. Jesus in the boat, they get in the boat. They row out to the middle of the Sea of Galilee. They were heading across, not the whole sea, but down across a part of the sea. And the text tells us, Matthew tells us that suddenly, because this was not unusual for the Sea of Galilee, suddenly, not a storm, not just a wind, a furious storm. And these are people who were very familiar with this region of the world. So this wasn't hyperbole. This wasn't an exaggeration. This was an unusually furious storm. Suddenly appears out of nowhere, came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, these are not very large boats, okay? And so This was everybody, and again, don't picture flannel graph and don't picture Sunday school. Let's just picture reality. They're on a very small boat. They can't see land in either direction because of the clouds and the rain is sideways, and they are soaking wet. They're not pretty. This isn't rock star Jesus. Nobody's pretty, okay? All their hair is matted and wet to their face, okay? And it's loud. Many of you have been out on boats in storms. It is loud. To talk to anyone, you got to get right up in their face or you have to yell. And then Matthew says, and Peter would come along later and basically say, yeah, this is exactly how it happened. Jesus was sleeping which is almost impossible. I think maybe he was faking. I don't know how in the world, but they thought he was sleeping. How do you sleep in a situation like this? Jesus is laying down, soaking wet, probably, and as this roaring wind and all of this storm goes on, and the disciples went to him, and again, they didn't wake him up like, Jesus, you know how you wake up your children? No, that's not like that. It's like Jesus. Remember, I don't want to yell all of this. Everyone is yelling. You can't be heard on this boat unless you're yelling. They went and woke him up and they said, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Wake up. And Jesus props up on one elbow. He doesn't even get up. And he says loudly, you of little faith. And they're like, what? There's hair in our face? No, you of little faith. He's having to yell this is so loud. And I think he's grinning because they are panicked, okay, with Jesus in the boat. You of little faith. And then here's this ridiculous question. No one would make this up. Why are you so afraid? What? Why are you so afraid? We're afraid because a furious storm just came up on the sea and the boat is sinking and water is flooding the boat and we may drown, and when you may drown, you are afraid. What a silly question. That's why we are afraid. But this isn't a miracle story to show that Jesus had power over nature. He's teaching them about fear. And look what it says. This is the best part. Then, when he finally got up, he didn't panic. God doesn't panic. Your Savior doesn't panic. Your Heavenly Father doesn't panic. Isn't that good to know? We panic. We panic because we project on into the future based on what we know and what we've seen and what we've experienced. But God, who created time, doesn't panic. This is what Jesus wants them to see. Perhaps this is what Jesus wants you to see and me to see. This is so powerful. Then he got up and he rebuked the winds and the waves. He spoke to them, and it was completely calm. Now, it's not unusual for this region of the world for these storms to come barreling down through the valley and just, create havoc in the Sea of Galilee. And then after a few minutes or in a little while, the storms move on through. But for whatever the reason, as soon as Jesus started talking, the storm moved on through. And what happens next is the point of this whole incident. And the men on the boat with Jesus were amazed. Of course they were. And they asked the perfect question. In fact, this is the most important question anyone can ever ask. They ask the perfect question. This is the question that if you're not a believer, or used to be a church person, or you went away, or you've never considered Christianity, this is the question. I mean, how did God create the world? And is there a creator? And how big is the universe? And is it, how many billion? I mean, those are fun things to talk about. This is the question. What kind of man is this? Well, it was a Superman, obviously, right? What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. They were amazed. Mark, who got his information from Peter, we think Peter was probably illiterate, and so when he told his story about his time with Jesus, he told it to Mark, and Mark wrote it down. That's why it's called the Gospel of Mark, but the information probably came from Peter. And when Peter told Mark this story, he said, and we feared a great fear. This was Mark's version. And we've used the same Greek word twice in the sentence. And this sounds like somebody who's trying to, I don't know how to put this into words. It's like we were afraid, and then we were really afraid. We were afraid of the storm, and then we realized who we were in the boat with, and we couldn't get much distance. We feared a great fear. This is so important for somebody here today or watching or listening. Their latter fear was greater than their former fear. Their fear of what had just happened, their fear of whose presence they were in, was greater than their fear of the storm. And for a fleeting moment, this is so important, and for a fleeting moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear. But just for a moment. For just a moment, in this moment, standing there in the boat, their confidence in Jesus and what Jesus was capable of overwhelmed their fear. In other words, the lesson that Jesus was trying to teach them was simply this, that you do not have to allow fear to be the boss of you. You do not have to allow fear to overwhelm you, because there's something more overwhelming. You don't have to allow fear to become the centerpiece of your life, the centerpiece of my life, because there's something more capable and more powerful than fear. So then, while it was still fresh on their minds, they get back and they kind of get back to business. And, a few days later, Jesus comes back around to this topic. And he's like, okay, let me talk about this. We had a field trip. It did not go so well. Everybody failed. But now, now that it's fresh on your mind, let me give you an illustration from nature. And so here's what he says to the guys. Look, don't be afraid. We're like, yes, we heard that. We got that. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body. Can I kind of tease this out a little bit, I think, what Jesus would say? I don't want to put words in Jesus' mouth. He doesn't need my help. Don't be afraid of anything that can kill your body. Don't be afraid of those who kill the body. Don't be afraid of things that threaten your body, but cannot kill your soul. In this moment, Jesus underscores what many of us grew up believing, that there is more to you than meets the eye. And there is more to you than your body. And there is a you that goes beyond the you that we can see. Jesus believed that. Don't be afraid of those who can only kill the body and can't do anything to the soul. If you're going to fear something, if you're going to place something at the center of your heart and your emotions, you should be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. It's like hyperbole. It's like, he's like, hey, if you're going to fear something, you should fear God. If you want to fear somebody, you should fear the one that controls your soul, not just your body. And then it's like he was saying, look, don't you remember that boat ride? Let's review the boat ride. Remember what happened? You were afraid of the wrong thing. You were fearing for your life. You were fearing a storm, and it wasn't that there wasn't anything to be afraid of. There was something to be afraid of, but there was something or somebody you should have been more afraid of. You should have been more dialed into. That's the point. Then he says this. Are not two, and this is so personal. He says, guys, aren't two sparrows sold for a penny? To which we're like, I don't know. And they're like, yeah, this is just their world they lived in. Sure they are. Yet not one of them, these sparrows that are basically worthless, yet not one of these sparrows will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. It's like, wait. So God cares about nature? Jesus, like, of course he did. He created it. It's his. And even, he says, but hey, let's not talk about sparrows. Let's talk about you for a minute. And even the very hairs, he's talking to his guys, on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. This is it. Don't be afraid. Why? Because you are worth more than many sparrows. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Don't be afraid. God considers you extraordinarily valuable. And this was Jesus' way of saying, yes, God is a personal God. God knows your name. God knows your circumstances. He is concerned about your personal lives. He knows what's going on, and he cares. And for many of us, in the deepest valley, for many of us facing the thing that just overwhelms us with fear, to know with confidence that God knows what you're going through, to know with confidence that God knows you, and many times that's all we need, and Jesus says, rest assured, God knows and God cares. Even when bad things are happening, even when your prayers go unanswered, you can trust him. He knows and he cares. Wow. So finally, they're starting to get it. It's like, okay, I think we got it. So we were afraid because there was something to be afraid of, but we got our eyes off what we should really fear, and you're with us, and you know our names, and you're tracking with us through the circumstances of life. And Jesus is like, okay, I think you're getting it. How about another field trip? So they have another field trip. This time it starts off really well, another story that you're very familiar with. This time they're out in the middle of nowhere. Jesus has preached too long. Maybe that's where we get that. And anyway, the sun's starting to go down, and these people are hungry. You know this story. And Jesus, one of the disciples or apostles comes to Jesus and said, we need to send these folks home. They're going to starve. They've been out here all day. And you went a little bit long. And Jesus is like, hey, I got an idea. You feed them. They're like, right, okay, we need to send these people. No, Jesus is like, no, you guys feed them. Like, we can't feed them. I mean, do you know how much money it would cost? In fact, there's not even enough food in this region to feed all these people. Jesus is like, no, you do it. You feed them. Then Jesus finds the little boy's lunch, remember that? And he prays over it. And then Matthew says, guys, I was there. Jesus actually broke up the little boy's lunch and split it up between us 12 and said, okay, feed them. And I don't know how to say it any other way, but we performed a miracle It was amazing. We actually started distributing this food, and then all these people were fed, and it was like, oh my goodness. So now the apostles, their confidence is at an all-time high. Look what Jesus did. Look what Jesus did through us. Who is this man? This is amazing. And then you may remember this. And then this isn't a coincidence. This isn't just, hey, this is what happened next because they couldn't think of anything else to say. The text says immediately, as soon as it dawned on everybody what had happened, immediately Jesus made the 12 and the disciples get into the boat. Now, it's a really interesting little Greek word, anakadzo. It means he coerced them. He forced them. This was not an invitation like, hey, maybe we should get in the boat. No, he said, guys, come here. No, come here. Leave them. Don't pay attention to the crowd. You pay attention to that crowd, your head's going to get too big. Come here. You guys, he forced them. You get into the boat. Now, why did he have to coerce them and force them to get into the boat? Because they remember the last boat ride. It's like, no, we're not getting any more boats with you. You get in the boat. Peter, I'm not getting in the boat. You remember what happened last time? We had to wake him up. We almost drowned. I tell you what, Jesus, we'll just walk. But the text says he had to force them to get, and some of these guys were fishermen. Well, now the apostles know what Jesus is up to. It's like, no, we're good. We feared not. In fact, we're feared not, and we're smarter than that. We're not going to get in the boat. And Jesus literally coerces them into getting into the boat. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat, and he said, look, I'm not even going with you. And they're like, oh, this is not going to go well. So he's helping push the boat off the sand into the sea, and he waves. He says, you go on ahead of me to the other side, and I'm going to go dismiss the crowd. So he pushes them off. They start rowing over to where he's supposed to go meet them. The sun goes down. Next thing you know, hours and hours have gone by, and they are stuck in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and they're rowing into a headwind, and they're rowing against the wind. They're rowing against the wind. They were young and strong, but they were still rowing. Oh, come on, against the wind, right? So they're out there. I mean, they're just committed. We're going to do it. But they're on a rowing machine. They are sitting still. And then, shortly before dawn, which means they've been out there for hours. We're going to do this, Shortly before dawn, the text tells us that Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Now, if you're not a Christian or used to be, I understand what maybe goes through your mind at this point. It's like, okay, calming the storm, maybe not, maybe the storm was just over. But see, Andy, this is why I can't be a Christian, all right? So now you're going to tell me I have to believe that Jesus walked on water. So let me just say something about this real quick. Christians don't believe Jesus walked on the water because the Bible tells us so. It is way better than that. Matthew, who was there, told us so. Mark, who got his story from Peter, who was there, told us so. And John, who was with Jesus throughout his ministry from the days of the Jordan River all the way through the crucifixion and resurrection, he told us so. They were all three eyewitnesses, and they were all three there, and they're like, look, I know. I'm just telling you this is what happened. And not only do they tell us this is what happened, they tell us something else. They tell us their embarrassing response to what happened. And here's why that's important. I've talked about this before, but I'll bring it up again, I promise, because this is a big deal. Literary critics use a device referred to as the criteria of embarrassment. The criteria of embarrassment goes like this. If somebody is writing a story about a revered or respected person, they are not going to invent stories that make that person look bad. So if there is an account in a story that makes the person who's revered look bad, it's probably authentic because no one would have made that up. Not only would they not have made it up, they would probably, if it was true, have left it out. And one of the reasons that people who've rejected the Gospels and rejected Christianity because they just stayed 30,000 feet away, the reason so many of them have become Jesus followers once they begin to actually engage with the details of the text is they bump into this. And they realize, wait a minute, these accounts of the life of Jesus don't make the heroes of the story look like heroes. They make them look normal. They make them look sometimes less than normal. They're just as much afraid and just as much doubters as everybody else. And so sure enough, not only do they tell us that Jesus walked on the water, the men who were there also tell us how they responded. And no one would have invented this, and here's why. Because when the Gospels were written, these men were still alive and they were still ministering in Judea and in different parts of the world and then coming back to Judea and Jerusalem. They were within the Christian community. They were the rock stars. John, who was with Jesus, Peter, who was with Jesus, Andrew, who was with Jesus, Matthew, oh my goodness, Matthew, the famous tax. These guys were the guys. No one, if anything, they would have left these embarrassing details out. Nobody would have invented a detail that would undermine the credibility of these guys. So why would they include their embarrassing response to what Jesus was doing, especially after Jesus has told them over and over and over, fear not. So here's what happened. Here's what we're told, because here's what happened. And who could blame them? When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they're terrified. They're terrified. And they said, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear. It's like, Matthew, is that what happened? Yeah, I was there. We just freaked out. It's like, Peter, you spent your whole life on the water. I know. It's so embarrassing. You sure? Mark's going, you sure you want me to include this, Peter? Yeah, put it in there. It's what happened. Nobody make this up. And then you know what happened? Jesus says, Jesus said, take courage. It is I. Guys, don't be afraid. How many times we've done field trips, we've done sermons, we've done miracles. Stop being afraid. As long as I'm here, there's no need to fear. As long as I'm with you, there's no need to fear. As long as I know what's going on in your life and you know that I love and care for you, there is no need to fear. Listen, even when there's something to be afraid of, you do not have to allow fear to be the boss of you. But once again, it didn't stick. This is encouraging to me. It didn't stick. They feared right up till the very end. At the end of Jesus' ministry, you know this part, I hope. He's on his way to Jerusalem. They're going with him. They've just raised Lazarus from the dead. They're thinking, this is it. This is the moment we've been waiting for. They get to Jerusalem. They are welcomed by the crowds, chanting his name, Hosanna. It turns political. He's going to be the king. They hang around in Jerusalem for about a week. Then they have a Passover meal together, and Jesus says, okay, listen carefully, guys. John, write this down. I'm inaugurating a brand new covenant, brand new relationship between God and man. They're thinking, this is it. I've already told you guys that we're starting a brand new movement. My ecclesia, my assembly, my congregation, I've already told you that nothing's going to stop it. They're thinking, oh my goodness, this is it. I'm glad we didn't leave early. And he said, and I'm going to step into the law. I'm going to step into the role of Moses here, and I'm going to give you a new law, a new command. This was it. This is what they've been waiting for. Feeding the 5,000, that was one thing. This was the moment they dreamed of. This was the moment their parents had told them may one day happen. But they didn't dream that it would happen in their lifetime, that the Messiah, God's Messiah, would show up and reestablish the nation of Israel and the kingdom and throw the Romans out. And then later that night, he's arrested. And what did they do? Stand by their man? No. They panicked. They hide, they lie, they deny. Then they watched him dragged to Golgotha, and he's crucified. And when they knew that Jesus was dead, boom, it's over. We don't know who he was. We thought we did. This was so exciting, but it's over. And along with everything else Jesus taught, it's over because Jesus said too much about himself. We can't keep this dream alive. We can't tell these stories because nobody's going to take them seriously, because no one can take Jesus seriously. Remember on the boat that day, guys, when we said, what kind of man is this? What kind of man is this? And we were convinced that this was a man that had to be from God, but clearly Rome can't, crucify God's Messiah. We were wrong. Everything about him, everything we believed was wrong. Everything he said about himself. Either we misunderstood or he lied. And then they peered into an empty tomb. And then they met their living friend. And they were back in business. Because, listen, the resurrection punctuated every single thing Jesus taught and everything he said about himself. And when Jesus rose from the dead, suddenly, for the first time, this is why reading the Gospels can be so confusing. Suddenly, for the first time, it all made perfect sense, especially what Jesus had to say about fear. Don't miss this. For us, the resurrection is about Easter. For them, the resurrection was about everything. For us, sometimes resurrection is just an Easter Sunday. For them, it was every single day. It was the source of their confidence. It was the source of their boldness. It was the source of their strength. Jesus' resurrection validated everything he had taught, especially what he said about fear. The world would continue for these guys to be a very scary place, but they didn't have to be scared because they feared. They had the greater fear. They finally got the lesson of the boat rides. They finally got the lesson of the sparrows. They finally got, fear not, I am with you. And they feared not. And they came out of hiding. This is amazing. We can't imagine this. We can't imagine it. There's no parallel in our lives. And they willingly faced down the very men that had Jesus arrested, beaten, and crucified. And then they went on to change the world, because fear not is what changed the world.